If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it would be greatly appreciated if you could give the podcast a 5-star rating. This helps other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. I'm your host, Andrew Pledger, and I'm a survivor of Bob Jones University. BJU is a fundamentalist college with its roots in white supremacy and is known for its culture of indoctrination, conformity, and control. Its influence extends beyond its campus, impacting Christian schooling, politics, biblical counseling, and evangelical Christianity. The school serves as a hub for churches, schools, and camps, and these institutions perpetrate its abusive teachings and practices. This show explores these areas of influence and amplifies the stories of those who have been impacted by Bob Jones University. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. Hello, everyone. Today, I am really excited for you to hear this interview with Dan Parsons. He is a former student and former staff member of Bob Jones University. And before he attended BJU, he actually attended North Love Baptist Church, a church with its own scandals, and I highly recommend listening to the Preacher Boys podcast as he covers this church extensively. Something that is also interesting about this church, which I'm hoping to explore, is that the RU ministry was born out of this church, and RU is a IFB addiction recovery program called Reformers Unanimous. And we also discussed this a little bit, but I'm hoping to cover it in depth in another episode. But in this episode, Dan offers us an intimate look into his experiences within these high control environments as he recounts the extreme fear-based tactics used to ensure compliance and conversion at North Love Baptist Church. He also discusses the challenges he faced while working at Bob Jones University. Then, towards the end of the episode, Dan shares a tragic experience that happened to his daughter and how his family sought justice and how the church treated them. Join us in this episode as we explore these critical themes, aiming to understand better the impact of fundamentalist indoctrination and the path to recovery. Hello, everyone. I am so happy to have Dan Parsons on the show today. I am really curious about his experiences at a Bob Jones affiliated church and then being at Bob Jones University as a student and on staff. But for those who aren't familiar with you, Dan, could you do a quick introduction of yourself?
Sure. My name's Dan Parsons. As Andrew mentioned, I was at a Bob Jones affiliated church. It was also affiliated with Hyles Anderson and the IBLP. And then I was on staff at Bob Jones for 12 years and went to school as an undergrad and a grad student. So I have both an undergrad degree and a master's degree from Bob Jones.
For those who are not familiar with the IBLP, I wanted to do just a very quick overview of it. So the IBLP stands for Institute of Basic Life Principles, and this was started by a man named Bill Gothard. And the IBLP is a fundamentalist Christian cult. And this man learned how to take fundamentalist teachings, package them in all these different homeschool curriculums and different programs, and then sell it and make so much money and spread his empire across the world, claiming that he had the answers to a perfect life and a perfect family. Just follow his principles and everything will be fine. And I highly recommend watching Shiny Happy People Duggar Family Secrets. This is on Amazon Prime, and this documentary covers the Institute of Basic Life Principles, the IBLP, and how the Duggars really made them popular because the Duggars were involved with the IBLP like very heavily. That's what they used to homeschool their children. So, and really what happens also was Bill Gothard, he would do all these seminars on his teachings, and churches, Christian schools, just Christian organizations across the US would send all these people to Bill Gothard's seminars. And then they would take his teachings and implement them throughout all these institutions, these Christian institutions across the US and even across the world. And another fun fact is Bill Gothard, of course, had ties to Bob Jones University. He called on Bob Jones when he was in trouble, and Dr. Camille Lewis covered this a little bit in the Surviving Bob Jones University podcast. And Bill Gothard was going to make a deal with Bob Jones about pushing their homeschool curriculum, but apparently that deal never came to fruition, and that's interesting to me. But yeah, he had a very strong impact on Christian fundamentalism and evangelical Christianity, but that was just a quick overview of the IBLP. And it's interesting because people do confuse the IBLP and the IFB. I know it gets confusing. So yeah, IFB is Independent Fundamental Baptist. IBLP is Institute of Basic Life Principles. They are separate things, but they have basically the same teachings and they do interact, but they're both different things, just so people know. Yes. And then what years did you attend the school? And then what years were you on staff?
Yes, I attended Bob Jones as a student from 1980 through 86. And then I taught Christian school at North Love Christian School for 3 years, and then came back on staff from 89 through 2001.
Okay. And then I'm curious, what was your position on staff at Bob Jones? What were some of the things that you did?
So I worked at the bookstore. I was the music buyer at the bookstore. And I guess I don't have a bookstore anymore. It's kind of weird. We were actually on campus last summer just briefly, very quick, and the student center was all closed up, but it doesn't look like there's much of anything there anymore as far as the bookstore is concerned. But I was on staff at the bookstore. I was the music buyer, school supplies, some other things too.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing those details. And yeah, I'm excited to really get into all of your story, but really the place I wanted to start was this Bob Jones affiliated church called North Love Baptist Church. And where is this located at?
This is in Loves Park, Illinois, which is just a little north of Rockford, Illinois.
Okay, got you. Okay, and
Yeah,
then this is the church you grew up in.
kind of, but we actually were in a what would be termed by Bob Jones as a new evangelical church to start with. And that's, like what I remember very young when we moved to Rockford. So we were there and we attended there for a good while until probably about 1977 or so. One of the assistant pastors at our new evangelical church in Rockford was Gary Smalley, love languages books and so forth. My dad was friends with him, and Gary Smalley left the assistant pastorship at Temple to go to the IBLP and Bill Gothard. And so my dad became very interested in the IBLP, and he started attending. He and my mom started attending. And then he actually would bring myself, even though I was still pretty young, 10 or 11, he would bring me to the basic seminars as well. And really from that influence in Bill Gothard, he became interested in joining a fundamental church because he felt like they were more in line with the seminar. And we left Temple and joined North Love in, like I said, it was about 1977.
Okay, I see. And so North Love Baptist, it's probably considered an independent fundamental Baptist church, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. The pastor when we went there was James Alley. He was from Tennessee Temple, and shortly thereafter, Paul Kingsbury became the pastor. He is from Hiles Anderson, so very much an stereotypical IFB church.
And then when you started attending this church with your family, what are some core experiences or stories that you remember and that really impacted you from this church?
Yes, there's a couple good ones. Soul winning is a very big thing in an IFB church, and we were always, trained in that. So one fall we had close to Halloween, we had a trail of terror, and we were almost coercing, like the bus routes do. We were coercing people to come to church and get saved. Same with the bus routes. We would hand out on the bus routes, you'd hand out candy and trinket to kids to get them to come to, bus church and Sunday school. Anyway, we were doing this trail of terror. It was a big extravaganza. We had different stations along the way. It was set up in the woods that were behind the church, and they were mildly scary, I guess. So we did use even fake blood. So I mean, I suppose that was maybe a little unusual for IFB churches to go to that extent. But one of the big things about that one is after the different groups had gone through the haunted trail, so to speak, and we got them all in, and there's of course going to be a message, a gospel message. And to set the tone for that message, once they got everyone into the gym and sat in the bleachers and so forth for the school, they had all of a sudden, a surprise to everyone, except for those of us who were working there. These men from the church, they busted in. They were all dressed up in camo and paramilitary apparel and so forth. And they had weapons. They had automatic style rifles and so forth. And they had blanks, and they made sounds, and they pretended to have a mass shooting, shut up the crowd and so forth. And that was, of course, intended to scare you into what would happen if you died tonight. And, where would you go? Heaven or hell? And we thought this was a good thing to do to win people to Christ, to have a mock mass shooting.
Oh my God. I am just over here, just like my mouth is like wide open, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like that is insane. Like I'm just myself in that scenario and just the trauma of not expecting this, people like believing that you're going to die.
Yeah.
You're putting people in that fight or flight state. You're making them vulnerable. And then it's purpose. It's manipulation. That's
Right.
just like so psychologically, emotionally, spiritually abusive. The IFB movement is known for their fear-based
Yeah.
tactics. There are some people, they'll do a showing on stage about hell. I've never heard about a fake mass shooting yet, so that's a new one to add to the list. Like oh my God, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
And like it's interesting because when you're in these high control groups, everyone's going along with it and you don't question. And it's always like, oh, it's for the greater good. And I
Yeah.
heard this justification. We're saving them from an
Right.
eternity in hell. So this is just a short time on earth. Even if they did consider the harm from this, I don't think that justifies it at all. But I
Right.
think it's absolutely horrible. But I remember their reasoning for those kind of fear-based tactics. When you were doing this, like what was going through your mind when this happened?
So of course I was one of the, the kids from the Christian school. We were workers in the whole thing. So we were privy to what was going to happen. And right, we thought we were doing a good thing. Never occurred to us that we were manipulating people. We were using their fears to get them to make what we called was a decision. Just thought that we were doing God's work.
And I'm assuming, like, I mean, I'm not going to assume. I'm just going to ask you, whose idea was this?
This was the youth pastors. This was Paul Kingsbury's idea.
Paul Kingsbury. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that, but I was like, I'll let you answer it. I'm not going to assume first. But, like, again, like Paul Kingsbury from Hiles Anderson at First Baptist Church, like Jack Hiles, he used all kinds of fear tactics and trained all of them. I have an uncle who attended Hiles Anderson, and like he never said the specifics. He's like, some of the things they taught us at Hiles Anderson, I look back now and say, that's awful. That's terrible that
Right.
they taught us to use some of these tactics for people. And I'm glad he was able to see through some of that. He's still IFB, but it's just, they train all these preachers and people, they send them out. And for me, now looking back, they claim that, the Holy Spirit will move people. And I know you're manipulating people. You're using fear. Like, this is not love. It's like you're going to die. Like, these terrible things are going to happen to you. So you better make this commitment. And it's just, oh, the independent fundamental Baptist movement. It's just, yeah, I mean, it's a cultic movement. It's a cult, but oh my gosh. And how many people would usually proclaim faith? I'm curious after that.
Well, that was always a big deal. Well, it's hard to say, but I'm sure there was at least 20 to 50. And anytime there was any kind of service at North Love, there was always an invitation. And that in and of itself, regardless of whether it was at, our, fake mass shooting or whether it was a regular church services, the invitations were also manipulative. The assistant pastor, who was also the choir director and song leader, and I was in the choir for several years, he would purposely have us sing just as I am in such a way that we would get people out of their seats into the aisles and down front to make a decision so that there would be good numbers, to show that people came forward. I was in high school, of course, for the Trail of Terror. So it's hard to say exactly how many. I'm sure at least 50 that night, but on a regular basis, anytime there was an invitation, it really didn't matter. You would have many people, I'm sure, at least 10 to 20 any service come down, maybe fewer on a Wednesday night. But and it didn't really matter what it was, if you wanted to be spiritual or get recognition in the church, you would go forward to recommit your life to Christ. Whatever it was, you would just decide to give up rock music, whatever it was, they wanted you to come forward and give a, public show that you were taking a step for God.
Yeah, showing that you're committing and
Right.
that
Sure.
you're self-sacrificing and giving up
Yes.
all these things. Yeah, wow.
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
really curious about the Trail of Terrors. Would this be spiritual based?
I don't think so, but now that I do think back on it, it was really just a bait and switch. There's all these secular haunted houses at this time of year. So let's do our own trail of terror to get people in and get them saved.
Okay, it's interesting. Yeah, it is really strange to me that an IFB church would be okay with doing something that's secular and that people would go along with that. But it's like, again, you said that there's a bait and switch, that manipulation in their mind. You're like, oh, well, we're using this as a way to save them. So it's okay. It's
Yeah.
fine. Yeah. And yeah, the IFB church I grew up in, it was usually we would do it very tamely in the beginning. It would just be drunk of treats. And then we would funnel them to this fellowship hall to then share this horrific, awful sermon on hell and scare them with that. So yeah, still horrible, but yeah, not a mass shooting, faking a mass shooting. That's just so extreme and horrible. Oh, okay. And then and something I want to touch on too, which is kind of interesting, which I've been learning lately, is that cultic groups or cults really, not all the time, but a lot of them do put people through this traumatizing experience that can bond people together. Like it's bonding in a sense to go through the same thing as someone else. And I think it's a really messed up way to bond people together and to have that loyalty. But that's just something that I realized when you said that. I was like, oh, that's something that cults do, and different like group activities or different things to get that adrenaline going and that group bonding. And anyways, whew, I was not expecting that story as the first, but thank you for being willing to share that because ugh, the thing is, like, these churches, they look like normal churches from the outside. People might think, oh, that's just a normal Baptist church.
Right.
But there's a lot of horrible, awful things, a lot of manipulation and abuse happening in the IFB
Yeah.
movement. And, people listening, there could be an IFB church right around the corner and you have no idea.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, are there any other stories or experiences you would like to share from that church?
Yeah, there's another one, and I'm glad you asked if there was any one other ones because there's really one other one that was came to be such a pattern of IFB cover up. Again, this was when I was in high school. I'm going to say it was my junior year, but our English teacher, who was also the soccer coach, also the basketball coach, also the previous choir director, song leader, etc. You have to wear many, many hats, as I'm sure you know. It's not enough to do just one job. You've got to do 20. But he was caught in a, sexual scandal involving minors. He was caught as a peeping Tom into the girls' locker room because as the basketball coach, he had keys, he had access to all the locker rooms whenever he wanted, and he was caught. The next day at school, you know, I think we spent almost all the day in chapel instead of classes because of this. He was not there, and they wouldn't say what he actually did. You had to find out about this, yourself from other students and so forth who did know. But no one actually said, they just said that he was caught in a sin. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm shaking my head over here for people or when, yeah, I'm just like, it's just, that is something that frustrates me so much about these churches is that, this is a crime, even though technically in their belief system it might be a sin, but for me that's not a strong enough word at all. It like really lightens it a lot, and it's like it waters it down. And when something is a sin, they don't talk about going to jail for that. For a sin, you repent and you get restored into the group, and no one else outside the group has to know at all.
Right.
And so it's just, anyways, yeah, it's really awful. But yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, keep on with the story.
But anyways, the manipulation because, after I'm sure there was some kind of message. I don't remember the message per se, but I do remember the senior pastor telling us all that, well, there's never been an easier time for you to come forward and confess your sins as well. You're one of our teachers had to do this, so you need to come forward and now confess your sins and get right with God. And of course, just the underlying assumption that we were all terrible sinners and that we needed to do the same. So that was a big deal. But interestingly enough, again, this was in the late 70s, so I'm not sure that there was mandatory reporting laws yet. But what happened to my English teacher, the soccer coach, the basketball coach, the choir director, and so forth? He went back to his home church in Colorado, in the Denver area, and just started teaching Christian school at their Christian school. That was just normal. Just sweep it under the rug and ship them off. And shockingly enough, we find out, today from now the prevalent documentaries such as, Shiny Happy People and so forth, how much of a pattern that became and how widespread that was and how many other networks there were that did the same exact thing. They took predators and they shipped them off to somewhere else where they could perform the exact same thing.
Yeah, it sadly is such a common thing in the IFB movement and other kinds of groups. And that was something the shipping and moving around was highlighted in a Let Us Pray
Let us pray. Yes.
documentary that covered sexual abuse in the IFB movement. And for some people, they would literally like raise money to help them move and provide all these things for them. And I'm just like, just watching this, and it's just, oh my God, it's completely wild to me and so completely against what they claim, at least, they stand for. But I really want to know more, unless, is there anything else you would like to share about
That,
experiences?
no, those were two that I
Okay,
thought you would
got
really
you.
appreciate.
But let's see. So I'm really curious about the pastor and leadership. And also, like you said, this was a BJU affiliated church. So I'm curious about like the BJU people throughout this church, probably in like the Christian school also, too.
Yeah, there was a heavy influence, and that's kind of eventually got me at Bob Jones. One of the teachers in particular, he would always tell me that he knew that God was calling me to Bob Jones. In fact, he said that he thought I should join his society, which was Basel, if I remember right. I didn't do end up going to Basel, but anyway, but that did set the tone. Also, North Love as a church cooperated with, a few other IFB churches in the area to sponsor a showing of Sheffy. So this was, before VHS and so forth. And
Mhm.
so
Yeah. And
Sheffy,
sorry,
go
I'm
ahead.
going to cut you off just for a second. For people who aren't familiar enough, Sheffy is a Bob Jones produced film from their own film production. Sorry, continue on with that story.
Sure. Yeah. So they sponsored a showing us Sheffy. This would have been, and again, I was still in high school, so probably 79. And Sheffy had just come out, just had been released. Local churches could rent it as an outreach program. And they rented an auditorium. The churches in Rockford rented an auditorium, and it was a big deal to get people in the community out again to have them see this film and get saved. And so that was the first time I ever saw Sheffy. And when that finished, again, a very emotional invitation and so forth, I thought at the time that that's when I was, so to speak, called to go to Bob Jones.
Yeah, I've heard this from people before. It sounds like a common thing where these people who go to Bob Jones are just so convinced, like, this is it. I remember Rich Merritt saying to me that someone told to him it's God's will for everyone to go to Bob Jones University. And I taught with Dr. Camille Lewis about this too. There's just this strange loyalty that is indoctrinated into people about the loyalty to Bob Jones University and just how good it is, how like supposedly spiritual, and like that's it, like that's the golden standard. It's just, and like it, and like when you hear this from someone, like when you heard him, like I think, God wants you to go there. What were your feelings around that? What was going through your mind?
It was just, unexpected. I was just a kid. I didn't really know very much at all. So the fact that there was someone that was that convinced, I'm sure probably influenced me greatly. We would have Bob Jones summer mission teams at the church, and, their ensembles and so forth would come. And in fact, Tim Fisher he was on ensemble one of those years, and he actually stayed in our home, and that was another confirmation for me. And I'm sure my teacher, you mentioned that as well. Well, it's no coincidence that your parents signed up to have people from the music team stay in your home, and it happens to be Tim Fisher. And he's telling you the same thing that, it's God's will for you, to go to Bob Jones.
Interesting. Yeah, so he's trying to say to you, oh, this is a sign. Like this
Right.
is
Right.
God's confirmation.
Right. It's kind of like confirmation bias.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Okay. And something else I'm curious about is I think Paul Kingsbury, he eventually did become the pastor. He was youth pastor and then pastor. He
Yes.
became the pastor. What year was that?
I'm pretty sure that was 1982. Could be off 1 or 2 years, but I was at Bob Jones at the time, but it was around 1982.
Okay, gotcha. And then who was the pastor that you grew up under when you were in that church?
It was James Alley.
Okay. And what do you know about him?
I don't know as much, and he didn't start the church either. There was another pastor prior to that, but he was from Tennessee Temple, but he was very much, aligned with the sword of the Lord, and anyone who appeared in the sword of the Lord as a fundamental preacher, he was aligned with them. So very much Jack Hyles, very much a fan of Jack Hyles. Certainly Bob Jones as well, because we would always have their music teams, their drama teams when they would come in the summers and even other times and so forth. And like I said, they were a big, one of the big partners to bring Sheffy to the community when it was released and have that showing. The youth pastor at the time, Paul Kingsbury, we would also take trips to various Christian colleges. I don't recall going to Bob Jones, but was more of a sort of Lord, like a broader approach than just a Bob Jones church. But they certainly included Bob Jones as one of the acceptable places for you to go to college.
I see. And something that is really just fascinating to me that I learned about this church is as I was researching it for our interview, Reformers Unanimous was born out of this church. For people who are not familiar, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but basically, Reformers Unanimous is Alcoholics Anonymous, but it's Christian. It's like the Christian version of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yeah. And it was actually started by a guy that I went to high school with, Steve Currington. He was, at North Love the same time I was. But you're exactly right. Essentially, they approach substance abuse from what they consider a Christian standpoint. And you're going to go through different workbooks and complete fill in the blank exercises. And that's going to help you recover from substance abuse. My parents were involved with Reformers. My mom would send me their materials while I was at Bob Jones. They're not much more than glorified Sunday school type exercises, and you're just filling in the blanks for various scripture lessons, things like this. A lot of the material is also from or very similar to what you'll find from Bill Gothard. So his type of exercises with the now infamous umbrella principle that we saw, let us pray and shiny happy people and so forth, but that was incorporated as well. So you work through your addictions simply by completing a fill in the blank workbook. And it was great for the church because they published all these materials and sold them to other churches, and you could even franchise this, and they had all these chapters nationwide and even worldwide. So it's a great money making opportunity for the church as well.
Yes, because I know I looked it up online. I can't remember how many. They have at least 1,000 chapters across the US, probably more than that, but that's at least I feel like in my mind that I'm thinking of. But I remember growing up in my IFB church. I don't know how regularly they would have them, but I just remember hearing about it a lot. And I remember hearing like, oh, like, those are people that struggle with different addictions and different things like that. And I thought, yeah, I don't know. I just thought it was interesting because then when I saw that about North Love, I was like, oh my gosh, I know I'm familiar with that. So that's something I'm curious probably about doing a deep dive into on another episode. But yeah, and then now I think you kind of already answered this question. So you ended up at BJU because of this teacher that influenced you. And so what were your expectations of the school before you arrived?
I thought that it was the top notch as far as the schools would be concerned. Their drama teams, their music teams were always probably a little more polished. They had that, established reputation for being around for quite a while. They had the history. Some of the other schools were, much newer. So, for example, their facilities were not as developed or as stable. So all of that was really, that met my expectations, what I thought would be there. Very, very large, it felt like you were part of a very established organization. And, how could anything be wrong? They had to be right. You could just see it all around you, all these buildings, all kids coming from schools all over the country and the world. And, certainly it was impressive to say the least.
And what I'm really curious about too is like, what are some core like negative experiences at BJU, and if there's any leaders that harmed you at the school?
Yeah. So I would say as a student, that didn't really happen to me. I know to a lot of other people, it certainly did. But when I became a staff member, then I started to see some things. For example, there was a longtime director of ancillary services, Fred Davis, and this goes to just demonstrate the control they had over people and how they would make you feel if you even deviated or questioned anything. So, as I mentioned, I worked at the bookstore, and typically during the summertime, they would have the teaching staff come and work in the various ancillary departments of the university. And one year they decided that they were spending too much money doing that. So their own faculty, they didn't want to pay them any more than what they had to. So they wanted them to, whatever, go out in the community, I guess, and get summer jobs. But they wanted, us as an ancillary division to, do our own work in the summertime, not to have extra help. And typically during the year, you had student employees and so forth that worked, and for whatever, they were the cashiers, they helped in the stockroom, etc. And during the summer, there was a lot that we did do, even though we didn't have as many students to shop and so forth. There was a lot we had to do to prepare for the school year, to get all those textbooks in, to get all the supplies in, etc. So we had a lot of things that we relied on them to do. But then one year, so no faculty, staff, helpers, none of that. But, Fred Davis wanted us to do it all ourselves. And he asked myself and some of the other managers to make sure and let him know of any problems that we encountered because of this new approach to summer labor. So we did definitely have some problems. And since Fred asked, I took it upon myself, probably stupidly, I guess, as I look at it, to detail some of the problems that we had because we were shorthanded. And I had a big list of them, and I sent them to him. And that was not well received, even though he had asked for them. He took it as, questioning authority and not following what he had intended to. And in fact, that right before school started, we would have an big ancillary kickoff meeting. And at that meeting, without mentioning my name and without telling me that he was going to use this as an example, he used it as a negative example. He stood up there and said to everyone in the ancillary service, I had one of our mid-level managers question my authority, and he talked about how bad this was, how wrong this was, how evil this was, and how you were not submitting to God-given authority. And I had no idea that he was going to say anything like that. He never once, even after he used me as an example, unnamed example, he never once came to me and said anything to me that he had a problem with the way I responded to his own request.
Oh my gosh. That's just, oh, I've heard stories of people hearing themselves in the pulpit, but like being unnamed. It's such just a manipulative and abusive thing to do. And it's so just toxic and harmful. Like, you're not even going to that person, but it's like a public shaming, but it's not because no one knows it's you. But I can imagine to sit there and hear that and to feel just that shame from that, or even just a shock, or even maybe just a little bit of like
Yeah.
embarrassment, or like feeling like, oh, like I did something wrong. And then it just makes you question, like, oh, like what else am I doing that maybe they don't like, or maybe they haven't told me about. And it's like, yeah, they're not being transparent and not communicating. So it's just, yeah, I'm so sorry. But regarding being on staff there, I am curious about anything else that maybe like you experienced or even saw that most people wouldn't know about that stood out to you.
So I can give you another example too, very, very similar, the shame. And also the fellow managers at the bookstore knew exactly who it was. So they knew. And, of course, my boss also knew, and he called me in the office and reprimanded me himself after the fact. But another thing that you might hear about, but not necessarily see at Bob Jones is what everyday people would just say is, tattletale. What's the hard to
This
remember?
the snitching culture or the snitching.
Snitching culture. Yes, yes, thank you. So this happened to staff members too, in very innocent settings. So one summer, I went to lunch at the dining common with another female coworker, and I don't remember exactly why. The people that we, like I would usually go with my wife, and I don't know why she didn't. But anyway, she was just like, hey, your wife's not here today, whatever. Let's go to lunch. All right. So we do. And wasn't even anything you'd think about at all. We didn't sit next to each other. We sat across the table from each other. There wasn't any of the common things that you would see for dating couples, like, oh, the guy carries the girl's tray back and things like none of that. But of course, there is some busybody. And again, do they ever come to you directly? Not usually, not unless it's something really bad. But this busybody person went to my boss at the bookstore, and said what a horrible person I was just for going to lunch at the dining common with another female colleague.
Oh my gosh. Like there are people there, these Boges and different other people who just look for to see and to read into anything to then snitch or tattle about, just to feel like they're the self-righteous person, and just the high they get from that is just, oh gosh.
Yeah.
But when that happened, like what did your boss say to you?
He said, you have to be an example. So you can't do this. This is wrong because you could cause other people to stumble. And at that time of the year, summertime, there wasn't a separation between staff and students. You were in with the students as well. So definitely you could cause a student to stumble and put themselves in a inappropriate situation. So it was a big deal. It was a drawn out thing. And he wanted to make you feel very guilty for something that's very, very small.
And did you ever tell this female colleague about this happening?
I'm not sure who was blamed more, but I'm sure it was mentioned to her as well. But I feel like he laid most of the blame on me because as a man, you're supposed to be the spiritual leader. You're supposed to know these things.
Okay. All right. And then any other things you'd like to share from being on staff?
So I may be jumping the gun here, but the one other thing that does stand out to me is um, the years that I was on staff. So we were there for 12 years. We had 3 kids. And sometimes you don't see things until you see your kids doing what you did. And we saw our children becoming very self-righteous and judgmental. One time we were driving down, I think we were driving to Sunday morning church on campus, and we were going down Wade Hampton, and It was warm out, so we had the windows down or whatever. We were at the intersection, almost ready to turn into the front gate. And there were some bikers next to us. And they had longer hair. They had cigarettes, whatever, typical biker type image. And our kids looked at them and they said, "Oh, they're smoking. They're going to hell." I kind of guess it really struck us that this is what's happening to our kids. Whereas I'm sure I would have done the same thing at one time or another, but it wouldn't have dawned on me what I was doing. But I'm seeing my kids do this. That really made me stop and think.
Oh, I see. It's kind of like a mirror you're looking into.
Yes.
And you're like, oh, wow. Like now that I see that outside of myself, it's just kind of jarring and eye opening and kind of like reveals things you didn't maybe think about deeply about yourself. And so, was that part of the catalyst?
Yeah, it really was. So after, it wasn't too long after that, that the longtime, manager of the bookstore, Bob Annan, they forced him to retire. There was a year there where all the staff members of a certain age were forced to retire. It helped the university's payroll. So many of these decisions, they love to say that they're not a business, they're a ministry, but they definitely had, business objectives in mind. And if they could save a buck by getting more people to retire, they did. So anyway, he was going to have to retire. It was said to me many times that I was going to be the next manager of the store. I was, heavily involved. I did many, many things for the store, et cetera, et cetera. And I was shocked to find out that the new director of ancillary services, Brent Honshaw, he didn't have that same idea. He had another person in mind who was one of his buddies from his days at Belk Simpson's, which was a department store in Greenville. And he wanted him to be the next manager. And I was shocked, and there was no application process, nothing like that at all. And when I told him that he was giving the appearance of just hand selecting rather than letting people apply, or, even letting the staff know that there was an opportunity, he said, "Okay, well, send me your resume and we'll get you an interview." He agreed with me. It probably didn't look the best. So I did. I sent him my resume, and he promised that he would give me an interview. He never did. Never did. Now, he did come back by and he said again, he said, "Look, we're not going to do an interview." That really bothered me. That really, really bothered me. And that was the summer that I decided just to cold turkey leave. And we ended up here in Pittsburgh.
And then that was in 2001.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. That was in
And
two.
yeah, and then did you let anyone know that you were leaving?
Yes. Within, after it was pretty much set that we were going to have a new manager, one of my other colleagues, this person didn't really have a great reputation. In fact, he was let go from the university a couple of years after all of this, after I had left too. But anyway, he had kind of a, I don't know, cutthroat reputation. So a couple of my colleagues were in a similar state. They were like, we're not working for this guy. And I had, done some job scouting on my own, but once it became apparent that this was the direction that they were going to go, we decided, and that was very stressful. That was very traumatizing, because the people that, like people at my church, my assistant pastor at my church was very much against us leaving. He said that this is not God's will for you to do that because of the way that you're doing it. There's something he wants you to learn from working under this man. So this is definitely not God's will. So internally, you're very torn when you hear things like that. But we thankfully, just did not want to stay there under those circumstances, and we decided to leave, and we did.
Oh, yeah, I am so glad y'all got out. And like, I'm curious because there's still a lot to unpack from those experiences. So when you get to Pittsburgh, how did y'all start unpacking that, or did that not happen till later?
Yeah, that was definitely tough because what I did mentally to reconcile things was to one thing that Dr. Bob III would always say was find a church, find a small church in somewhere in the country and go work for them. So in order to overcome that hurdle of God's will, I did find a church here in Pittsburgh, Bob Jones Orbit church. Bob Jones grad started and so forth. It was a small church. It was in an underprivileged neighborhood in Pittsburgh. And, I thought that this would be how I could also say, oh, it's God's will for us to go because we're going to work for this. We're going to help. We're going to be, working for this small church. We didn't end up staying there very long because I think it was just Wilkinsburg Baptist Church, if I remember right.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And then what prompted y'all to leave that church?
It was so far away from where we ended up living. You just I know I came up with that just to overcome that, God's will hurdle mentally. So it wasn't practical at all because it was in a completely different area of the city. Just going, just the drive from where we were, the area that we were living in to that church was over an hour easy. We decided that we wouldn't put the kids in a Christian school. We sent them to a public school because we weren't sure when I would have a job. So we didn't know that we'd have the money for a Christian school. So that really accelerated the unpacking process there because we found out that our kids, surprise, surprise, were behind, even though we were told that Bob Jones Elementary School education is the very best you could get in the entire country. But they were behind in science and math. Surprise, surprise.
Oh, wow, I see. Okay. And I'm because like okay, but I know there was one question about your daughter being sexually abused at a church function. What church was that? And I don't know how you want to approach that in the interview, like where that needs to come in.
So that came a little bit later. So yeah, so after, once we realized that it was really not practical to be involved with this church, basically on the completely opposite side of the metro area, we stayed at the church, which was also a fundamental church where my wife and I were married, and my wife's parents go there too. We stayed there, and even that didn't last a terribly long time because for me, for different people, doubts start coming in different areas. And one thing that I had been interested in, even right before I left the bookstore, was various views on the end times. And I really came to question the premillennial, predispensationalist viewpoints that were pretty much taught as the only view permissible on the end times. And the church that my wife's parents too went to, and that we were married in, we probably would have joined there except for you had to sign a statement of faith, and part of that statement was a premillennial predispensationalist viewpoint at the end times that I didn't feel comfortable. It seems like a small thing now, but I didn't feel comfortable, consenting to that because that was something that I had researched on my own up to that point, and I didn't really think that that was the only acceptable view. So I started to realize that there was other doctrines within Christianity that were very Christian and very much in existence, and they had just as much of a history as pre-mill, pre-dispy. To be, for one example, they had just as much of a Christian history as what we were taught all our lives as the only truth and the only Christian viewpoint that was acceptable. And that really started making me question a lot of things. And because of that, we started going to churches outside the fundamental circles. And we ended up at a Southern Baptist church, which is kind of interesting because, it's a soft landing for people who have been in the IFB to go to a Southern Baptist church. We ended up there in a Southern Baptist church, and we really liked it. It was a small church, but really was what we were looking for, leaving independent fundamental Baptist churches. But they had, some of the same approaches to abuse that you're going to find in the IFB. And after we had been at this church for, 2.5, 3 years, my oldest daughter, was at a after church youth function, and she was molested by another man at the church. Found out later on that he, another pattern. He had another girl who was at the church, who was from somewhat of a unsettled background, I guess would be the best way to put it. And because he was supposedly doing something good, he had her stay at his house. And she suffered some of the same inappropriate advances and so forth, sometimes using money, giving her money for, and it really wasn't, to the extent perhaps of some of the stories on Let Us Pray, but it was inappropriate touching. And that's what happened to my daughter. And she came home after that function in tears. She let us know what had happened. And I knew right away that I was going to call the police, because this is a crime. I did call my pastor first, and he pleaded with me not to call the police. In fact, he hung up on the phone and came over to our house to plead with me not to go to the police. And he said that, we should follow, you're going to have to help me with the reference here. We should follow the pattern in Romans that you don't take your brother to court. I did go to the police. He actually drove to the station behind me. And even when I got out, because I first called the police and they said, well, for anything like that, you have to report this in person. So that Sunday night, I went down to the police station, and my pastor followed me. And even when we got to the police station, he got out of the car and said again that I was violating scripture if I did not go to my brother first. But for me, my daughter had told me what had happened. And how could I not go to the police?
Yeah. Ooh, wow. And so you went in and reported it. Was he waiting there for you when you came out, or how was that interaction after that night?
Yeah, after that night, I believe he did wait for me and so forth. And after that night, so I don't quite remember how we left that evening, but I did go in. He probably left after I went into the station, and I made the report to the officer on duty and so forth that actually took the case and investigated. But after that, he called me before the next Sunday and essentially told me that I was not welcome back at the church.
Oh, wow. And do you mind me asking what church is this and what the name of the
Yeah,
pastor is?
right. This was West Hills Baptist Church in Moon Township in Pittsburgh, and the pastor was Larry Walker. The report was, reviewed by the police, and they actually did file charges. They interviewed myself, my daughter, and another girl at the church. And they did bring it to a hearing. And again, the pastor had called me a couple different times, basically told me that I wouldn't be welcome back at the church. I shouldn't come back. I also, even though I was actually ordained at that church, so I wasn't welcome back. And he would call me from time to time while all this was going on. He called and told me that the head deacon came up with what he thought was a very appropriate assessment of the situation. He said that no one's ever going to be able to trust your daughter again. There never was anything about the church member who committed a crime. And no surprise, he and his family were some of the biggest donors to that church. But anyway, at the hearing, so a few months later at the hearing, I pretty much cut ties. We tried to go to various other churches in the area and so forth. We didn't go to any other Southern Baptists. We would try out different denominations. We never settled anywhere permanently, but I did at the hearing. That was probably the last straw for me, because the pastor, my former pastor, was there, and I saw him, and he would, through that whole time that we spent there that day at the hearing, which was probably about 2 to 3 hours, the judge calling various people. It wasn't a trial. It wasn't a trial yet. It was just a hearing. So he had us all in the courtroom for a while. Then you'd leave. He'd call various people in. But through the whole time, the pastor would not look me in the eye one single time, even though if you and I were in the same room, we're about the same distance apart. Of course, as a dad, I was enraged, and he wouldn't even look me in the eye. There was one portion where the judge wanted both of the girls to come in. So he's going to have everyone else leave the courtroom, and the defense attorney, who kind of a typical, what you think of as a snake in the grass attorney, kind of a sleazy attorney type. He protested and said, well, the court's going to have their recorder in there. I need a recorder too. So the judge allowed him to pick somebody. So he picked the pastor's wife. And the pastor actually said, to his wife, Karen, you stay here and you take notes for the defense attorney. That just, again, that just turned my stomach. That I couldn't believe the judge allowed that. But anyway, it is what it is. But eventually the man did plead to a lesser charge, and he did have to register and also do community service.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for sharing all those details. And I'm so, so sorry that that happened to your daughter. Like, you did the right thing, but still it was so difficult. Like, former pastor gave you so much pain. Yeah, it's just absolutely horrible just to hear these typical responses to abuse that happens in these environments. But when all of that was over, like, what was your view of like Bob Jones and even just Christianity in general and in the Baptist world?
Well, for a while, you just kind of want to hide it and not talk about it. And as years went on, and I discovered through some of the various Facebook groups and so forth that even though this happened in a Southern Baptist church, not an IFB church, the pattern was exactly the same. And the one reason these things happen was their, view on women as they need to be submissive. They cannot speak out, et cetera, things that, repeated time and time again. And so it really made me wake up, and I started to hear other stories that followed the exact same pattern. And it wasn't too long, especially after I started, hearing other people's. And we had left the church because it just didn't seem like we could get away from it. The head deacon at West Hills that had told the pastor our daughter would not be trusted anymore. We were going to another church where his son-in-law and daughter were present, and we didn't join that church, but we wanted to be involved. We were trying to do what we thought was right and good. And they, we found out that they had kind of spread disparaging comments about us because of what happened with their parent, so we didn't stay at that church either. And we finally realized that it wasn't going to be any different, and we left. My view of Christianity now is mostly the hypocrisy that I see time and time again, the way that they treat other people, the judgmental nature of what they say. I haven't been to church since probably 2009, 10 or so. It's been a while.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you took the steps to question and do what was best for you. And like as you're saying that, I can just hear all the like points growing up. It's like, oh, no one's perfect, no organization is perfect. And like, what is kind of your thoughts on those common things of like, oh, no organization is perfect, no group is perfect? What are your thoughts on people saying that?
I feel like it's really dismissive and it really is not focused on the pain that they're causing to victims, which is certainly what I saw with, what happened to my daughter. No one ever stopped and asked, about her. How could they help her? There was never any of that. And that just really, really opened my eyes to the lengths they would go to protect the organization. And that's what's important. Not, you know, what they say is important. They might say that the people are important, etc. But when it comes down to it, when there's, something that could endanger the organization, they circle the wagons. And if you're the one that potentially could cause problems to the organization, you're on the outside of that circle. They're not going to want to include you. And, I think the slogan, many churches have slogans, but I think the slogan for that church at the time for West Hills Baptist Church was a family of friends. Well, we were told in no uncertain terms that we were not family anymore. And certainly no one wanted to be our friend anymore. Not a single person from that church ever came to our house to ask us how they were doing, how we could help, or how my daughter was doing and how they could help. So extremely hypocritical. It's just the extent that they went to protect their organization. It's very typical. And when it was happening to me at the moment, again, you feel like that's only that it's you, you must have done something terrible, for that to happen to you. But these patterns are repeated. I'm sure you've heard many, many stories. These patterns are repeated time and time again. And it's not just me. It's not just any one of us. These are ingrained in their way of thinking, their teachings, their theology. It needs to be shared so other people can be warned and so you can do better than be involved in one of these high control groups.
Oh, yes, I agree 100%. And thank you so much for saying that because there is so much power in sharing those experiences because people hear, oh, they're not alone. And I think that's what a lot of these documentaries are doing. And these organizations hate it when these documentaries or these podcasts come out because it connects survivors together. Because for the longest time, I think a lot of us have been separated. But like once these projects happen, you like connect together and band together for change and trying to hold these people and organizations accountable. But I really, really enjoyed hearing your story, Dan, and thank you for just taking this opportunity to share it because I know it's not easy. But is there anything else you'd like to say or cover before we end this interview?
I wanted to say thank you, Andrew, for all you do in interviewing people. And you're so right. It's so important to share these stories and for anyone to realize that you're not alone. Um, it happens. And if you are someone that's been in one of these high control groups, I would just encourage you to leave, even though you might think that it's against God's will and this is how you've been brought up. There's a real world out here, and you'd be shocked at the people on the outside who love and care for you regardless. I found more unconditional love outside the church than I did inside the church.
Mm. But yeah, thank you again for coming on. And this was Beyond BJU Exposing Fundamentalism. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating, this will help other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.